The first light broke through Buckingham Palace with all the gentleness of a whisper in silk. Lace curtains danced in the early spring breeze, filtering gold across polished parquet floors and gilded frames bearing centuries of faces, statesmen, horses, and love lost to time. The air held a hint of citrus and tea leaves, drifting from the bone china cup set lovingly beside her on the side table. Even here, in solitude, she carried the crown in her spine. Elizabeth turned gently toward her. "Good morning, darling," she said, brushing a hand down Willow's russet back. A few more quiet moments, past the kind that only exist in places where silence is allowed to bloom. There were no cameras, no courtiers, no obligations, this minute. And yet, she was regal. The Today program echoed across the room, full of headlines and policy chatter. She nodded here and there, lips barely moving, noting a detail or two for later tidbits, to be raised in polite but pointed questions when ministers visited. The Times, the Telegraph, even the Financial Times, whose pink pages tickled her sense of British irony. No scandal today, not yet. She was never a passive listener. "Your Majesty," came the voice of Angela Kelly, her trusted dresser. "Shall I lay out the powder?" And the pearls with the oak leaf clasp. Every button she fastened had been chosen for narrative. Powder blue was calm but assertive. Pearls were never political. And the oak leaf, a nod to Scotland, whispered subtly with pride. Earl Grey, no milk. 2 tea biscuits stacked atop a folded linen napkin embroidered with Windsor blue. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Queen Elizabeth II opened her eyes, not jarred by alarm nor beckoned by sound, but stirred by instinct honed over decades. She sat up slowly, deliberate in movement, with posture straight and shoulders square. Willow, the eldest corgi, stirred in her basket by the fireplace, head lifting with alert devotion. The monarchy survived in its rituals. And so did she. At 7:45, the BBC Radio 4 broadcast came on, just enough for a soak, not enough for indulgence. As she lowered herself into it, she gazed across the marble tiles and remembered her father. King George VI had preferred colder baths. He claimed they steeled the nerves. At precisely 8 o'clock, the bath was drawn. 7 inches? No more. Always the same warm, but not decadent. Elizabeth smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant for one's own heart. It faded as swiftly as it came. By 8:30, breakfast was served in her private sitting room. A modest bowl of cereal, special Cahan toast with marmalade. She disliked elaborate meals at this hour. Granola was too sharp, porridge too nostalgic. Special K held no memories, and that was ideal. Just fuel for the duty ahead. Between bites, she read the broadsheets. Soon, the knock came. A quiet, professional rap on the mahogany door. "Yes," Elizabeth replied. The Queen rose from her seat with the grace of someone who knew every eye in the realm might once again rest upon her, even if only in a photo. As Kelly helped fasten the final button, Elizabeth glanced out the window at the palace gardens below. Today would be tea, letters, meetings, horses, dogs, and one more red box. Just like yesterday. Just like tomorrow. But in this moment, she breathed in the quiet glory of routine. The red box had arrived. It always did, as reliably as the sun rising beyond Buckingham's south wing. Crimson leather, gold hinges, dulled by decades of whispered power, and inside documents, dispatches, decisions. Each one required her eyes, her thoughts, her legacy. The first paper bore the seal of the Home Office. Terror legislation reviewed. She scanned it not for loopholes or flaws, but for impact. Could this sentence change a life? Would that clause echo for years? Queen Elizabeth placed a box atop her desk with a reverence that seemed ecclesiastical. To others, it was paperwork. To her it was the compass of empire. A question here, a dissent there. She never ruled, but she refined. Within its walls lay the heartbeat of governance, and she through decades and prime ministers remained the quiet stethoscope. The red box held memos from the Commonwealth, treaty updates from Australia, condolences to distant governors. Some carried the warm signatures of elected leaders. Others were bare sterile, expecting hers. She undid the latch, fingers deliberate, still unshaken with age. Churchill, her first PM, who had once chuckled after a late evening dispatch. "You read too fast, Your Majesty." Tomorrow, it would come again. The red box had seen them. Old Churchill, Thatcher, Blair, Cameron, still waited faithfully each morning, regardless of headlines or history's mood. "It gives me no time to prepare a defense," Angela entered briefly, announcing an upcoming ambassador's visit. Elizabeth nodded, half immersed in foreign policy notes. She took up a fountain pen, same one Philip had given her when Charles was born. Nibbed to paper, she annotated with precision. The documents were reviewed, annotated, and returned for response. No, just quiet stewardship. Outside, Willow barked faintly at a gardener. Elizabeth didn't flinch. Her focus was armor. As she turned to a letter from the Prime Minister, a memory surfaced uninvited. She smiled softly at the recollection. He had been brilliant, infuriating, and deeply fond of her. By 10:45, she set the lid back down. She stood from the desk, smoothing her skirt, and turned toward the corridor. In 15 minutes, she would greet the foreign ambassador from Senegal. Her pearls were perfect, her posture impeccable, but none of them not pressed. Not dignitaries would know. She had just spent the morning holding the machinery of government in one hand. The red box waited in silence. The crackle of parchment, the scent of ink, the whisper of memory in a folded page. At 11:15 a.m., Queen Elizabeth sat in her private study. A stack of carefully selected letters rested before her, chosen from the thousands sent each week by centenarians, well-wishers, critics. The return address bore a hand-drawn corgi stamp. Inside was a scrawled message in green crayon, and a generous sprinkle of romantics who still wrote as though monarchy belonged on their mantelpiece. She picked up the top envelope. She turned to her aide nearby. Please send a reply. Tell young Ezra that my corgis, while spirited, have superior spatial awareness. He asked whether the Queen ever disagreed with ministers, and, if so, what she did. She smiled at the boldness, not disrespectful, but curious, thoughtful. Dear Queen, I am 6, and my dog is silly. Mine did once. Mum was mad. Love. Ezra from Leeds. Elizabeth Chokoldasoff. Real laugh. Reserved only for moments like this. Next, a letter from Mrs. Eileen Robbins of Devon, age 99, politely requesting to be added to the royal birthday telegram list. Angela returned with a velvet box containing a brooch for the afternoon's engagements. Quiet counsel often resonates more deeply than public protests. Elizabeth paused, lifted her pen, and signed the birthday card herself. A century deserved a personal touch, but her heart lingered in crayon-colored corners of the kingdom, where children asked about dogs, birthdays, and dinner. Absolutely. Another letter bore the blue ink of a university student studying constitutional law. It read. Through them, she glimpsed how the nation saw her. Sometimes formal, sometimes fairy tale, often surprisingly human. She wrote, in reply, Disagreement need not be loud. At the bottom of the pile lay a piece of stationery covered in glitter likely smuggled past royal protocol. Dear Queen Elizabeth, I think you are very pretty and should wear a sparkly crown more often. Also, do you like chicken nuggets? Love from Marissa, age 7. Elizabeth's eyes twinkled. She scribbled her reply. Sparkles are best reserved for As for chicken nuggets, I must confess they haven't found their way to my plate. Yet. She sat back and sighed. These letters were abridged, not grand or gilded, but genuine. A knock interrupted. Elizabeth nodded, still holding the glittery letter. Do you suppose Marissa might enjoy a photo of the corgis? She asked. Angela smiled. The Queen rose. Her schedule waited, and somehow, that was governance too. At precisely noon, the Queen stood at the threshold of the green drawing room. The air hummed with formality, polished shoes, and carefully rehearsed titles. In 5 minutes, the ambassador of Senegal would arrive. Perfect, ma'am, she whispered. The protocol was simple, but simplicity in monarchy was an illusion. Every moment held centuries. The room was not yet full, but somehow already heavy with expectation. Courtiers stood with posture only achievable through years of royal service. The scent of polished wood mingled with soft perfume, and through it all, Elizabeth walked a presence so still, it seemed timeless. She turned her head slightly to the left, inspecting her reflection in the gilt-edged mirror. Powder blue serene, non-political, pearls a silent reassurance, brooch oak leaf for strength inherited. Behind her, Angela gave a final nod. Elizabeth stepped forward, every phrase crafted for balance, warmth with distance, engagement without entanglement. She thanked him, not as a ruler, but as a hostess of centuries. As he exited, Elizabeth turned briefly to a footman. Portraits had been taken, protocols completed, yet she remained untouched by spectacle. The ambassador entered, flanked by aides and smiles. Elizabeth offered her hand, palm down, fingers firm but graceful. "Welcome to Buckingham," she said. Formal greetings passed like well-practiced lines of a Shakespearean exchange. She led with kindness, but held the rhythm of authority. Her smiles were signatures each signed for the occasion. A photograph followed. The Queen turned her head. 15 degrees. She had learned long ago that this angle carried dignity. The ambassador smiled wide. Elizabeth smiled politely. "You must find London rather brisk this time of year," she said, with a flicker of empathy. She eased him, ever so subtly, with questions about trade, history, and his surprised British horse breeds. Her knowledge was vast, rarely boastful, he replied, grateful and nervous. After 20 minutes, the meeting concluded. Please send a note of thanks to his wife. Mention the gardens. They seemed to have pleased her. She returned to her study as the halls reset. The next appointment was hours away, but the impressions she gave would ripple through embassies and reports by morning. In her private room, she removed her shoes, a sigh of relief, so slight it barely touched the air. Because for Elizabeth, diplomacy was not performance. It was repetition, and repetition was rain. At precisely 4 o'clock, the Queen's day pause not stalled, not slowed, but gently redirected. Inside the private sitting room overlooking the palace gardens, a silver tray awaited. On it, cucumber sandwiches trimmed of crust, jam pennies, layered like edible medals, and shortbread nestled beside a folded linen napkin. Willow and Harley, her corgis, padded in behind her and stationed themselves near the hearth, ever faithful and ever hopeful for crumbs. The Queen poured the Earl Grey herself, a habit she refused to delegate. Milk to the side. She preferred it simple, clean, like most of her decisions. The kettle hissed like an old friend, and the scent of bergamot curled through the air. Elizabeth frowned thoughtfully. "Let's not fell it yet," she said quietly. "Give it another season." It was not small talk, it was gentle bonding born from routine and affection. Elizabeth entered without announcement. No fanfare, no photographers, just the quiet ceremony of porcelain and port. Angela Kelly was already seated nearby, her hands folded respectfully, but with ease born from years of closeness, just spoon against saucer, and the Queen, sipping tea with centuries in her shadow. They spoke softly of weather goddess, and an amusing note from Lady Sarah Chatto about a bird feeder gone rogue. Angela laughed. Elizabeth smiled. Halfway through, a footman entered discreetly with an envelope. "Pardon, ma'am." A reply from Balmore. She opened it without ceremony, scanning the letter. It was from the estate manager, updating her on the health of an old birch near the stables. In the stillness, she remembered childhood parties, wartime meals, and the first time Philip made her laugh so hard her tea spilled. Angela glanced up. "Still hoping it rebounds. Old trees," Elizabeth replied, "like old monarchs, deserve patience." Outside, the sky softened into a hazy blush. Time drifted gently here. No alarms, no shouts. She picked up a chocolate biscuit cake, her guilty pleasure, and Corgus stirred. The clock chimed. Tea time had ended. Elizabeth rose, smoothing her skirt with the elegance of someone who had turned even biscuits into ritual. And just like that, the crown continued. It was 5:30 when Queen Elizabeth stepped out into the gardens. The late afternoon sun spread its gold across stone balustrades and Duquesne grass, framing Buckingham's backyard as more than mere greenery. This was history landscaped into symmetry. Topiaries shaped like emblems, flower beds arranged in seasonal logic, and winding paths worn smooth by decades of quiet footfalls. The Queen walked without hurry. Her pace was deliberate, the kind born not of age, but of awareness. Every step through these gardens echoed with footsteps from years past. Willow barked once, tugged gently on her lead, and was joined by Muick and Sandy, tails aloft, like furry banners. "Stay close, my darlings," she murmured, and the Corgus clustered near her hem. The gravel crunched softly underfoot. To her right, the rose bushes she had planted after Philip's passing still bloomed her, fragrant and unapologetically sentimental. She paused and touched a petal, then continued walking. She remembered her childhood walks at Balmoral, where the trees whispered secrets and the air smelled wild and mossy. A gardener tipped his cap as she passed. She nodded, pleased that he didn't interrupt her solitude. In her reign, silence was earned not given. She liked to watch him disappear around corners, knowing he would always return. She reached the pond, where dragonflies played above the surface and ducks murmured like sleepy diplomats. Sitting on a wrought iron bench, she watched the corgis sniff at reeds and reflected quietly. Elizabeth smiled and rose. "Behave, you lot," she said. her voice touched by affection and command. The birch tree beside her leaned slightly westward, age and weather conspiring to bend it toward the palace, as if seeking shelter. Philip had always walked ahead, whistling for the dogs. She never called him back. Each one had a story, but today she let them rest. The gardens weren't for memory alone. They were for living. Today, he did not return. The corgis yapped at a squirrel, breaking her reverie. She took the longer path, back the one lined with old hedges and stones engraved with Latin phrases. As the palace came back into view, she glanced over her shoulder once. The trees rustled softly, and for a moment, she imagined they bowed. She didn't bow back. She walked up. The stables stood beyond the west gardens, tucked behind a wall of ivy and tradition. Time moved differently there, marked not by clocks, but by feeding schedules and the rhythm of hooves on hay. The air was earthy with the scent of straw, wood, and horses, her kind of sanctuary. It was nearly 6 o'clock when Queen Elizabeth arrived, her shoes tracing the familiar stone path. The stable hands bowed slightly as she passed. No trumpets, no photographers, just a quiet nod of recognition between monarch and stewards of creatures she cherished more than ceremony. She walked to the first stall, where Carlton Lima, Emma, her beloved fell pony, nickered softly and nudged forward. Here, she was not queen, but caretaker, confidant, companion. She checked the water, the feed, ran her hand along Emma's flank with practiced ease. No speeches, no protocol, just empathy shaped like touch. Elizabeth reached out instinctively, her gloved hand meeting velvet muzzle. Bits, bridles, saddle pull, perfectly arranged like lines in a... Nearby hung an old portrait of her riding at Windsor, one hand holding the reins, the other resting lightly on her thigh. Yes, Elizabeth lingered for one more moment, letting the silence speak. Let's take the river trail this time, the quiet one. But because horses had taught her how to move with grace long before the crown ever did. She was 23. The photo held no crown, just wind in her hair and a gleam in her eyes. "You're looking well today," she murmured, voice softened by fondness and routine. She entered the stall. The grooms knew better than to follow. Across the way, a young gelding pawed the floor, restless and proud. The queen did not race for wealth or spectacle. It was about rhythm, courage, and connection. Elizabeth approached with slow elegance, letting him smell her hand. "He reminds me of Oriole," she said to no one. Fiery, but soft at heart. Oriole had been her first real racehorse, a gift from her father, a memory galloping through decades of reins, ribbons, and rosettes. She exited the stall and walked past the tack room. "I was faster then," she whispered, almost amused. Her senior groom stepped forward. "Would you like us to ready Emma for your ride tomorrow, ma'am?" Elizabeth paused, then nodded. The sun dipped low, and the horses shifted in their stalls, tails swishing like pendulums. Then she turned and left the stables, her gait measured, regal, not because she was queen. At 7:30, dinner was served. No banquets, no trumpets, just grilled Dover sole, steamed spinach, and a crystal glass of Dubonnet and gin. The queen sat at her private dining table, laid with linen and candlelight. Silver cutlery gleamed beneath the flicker. But tonight's meal held no ceremony, only sustenance. She ate slowly, chewing in silence, punctuated by thoughts she never voiced aloud. Across the table, an empty chair remained untouched, a quiet sentinel to Philip's absence. She never asked it to be removed. Willow curled near her feet. The corgi didn't beg, didn't bark, just waited, as though understanding that this hour held sacred stillness. After the final bite, dessert arrived, a sliver of chocolate biscuit cake. The same she'd been served as a young princess during wartime rationing. The television clicked on with familiar static. It was a documentary tonight, something about steam trains and Yorkshire hillsides. She preferred quiet programs, especially ones with nature or history. The dramas could wait for Sundays. She took one delicate forkful, then set the rest aside. It was an indulgence, it was memory. She thought of Balmoral, of Ascot, of dusty carriage rides, and the scent of wax-polished floors, of laughter echoing through ancient halls. By 8:15, she moved to the drawing-room, slippers exchanged for comfort, pearls gently loosened. As the narrator's voice drifted through the room, Elizabeth's gaze wandered not to the screen, but to the window where twilight folded across the palace lawn. At 8:45 she reached for a small notebook bound in navy leather. It wasn't a diary, exactly. More a ledger of thoughts. New carriages, new parades, just hush and heritage. She didn't write every day, but tonight, She did. Young, eager, reminded me of Canada in spring. The roses near the pond are early. Willow barked at a duck again. The birch leans farther than last season. I will let it stand. Met the ambassador. Tea was quite perfect today. Marissa's glitter is still on my desk. She paused, tapped her pen, and added, greater than Philip would have teased me for choosing the quiet documentary. I miss his voice when trains whistle. She closed the book gently. Outside, the night deepened. Elizabeth leaned back into her chair, the monarch without a court, sipping silence and wearing twilight like velvet on her shoulders. Tomorrow would come, and she would rise again. But tonight, she rested. Not in power, not in pageantry, in peace. At 9 o'clock, the palace lights dimmed softly, like old memories. Queen Elizabeth entered her bedroom, shoes already exchanged for silk slippers. The air held a quiet warmth, scented with lavender and antique wood. The brooch oak leaf claspers next, laid gently into velvet lining. With each piece, the uniform of sovereignty unstitched itself, leaving only Elizabeth behind. No advisors, no cameras, just the hush of evening brushing against centuries of legacy. She stood before the dressing table, removing each pearl earring with care. Willow leaped onto her cushion, circled once, and settled. The Queen's hand brushed her head. Thank you, she whispered. It wasn't clear if she meant the corgi, the day, or something deeper. She picked up her journal and paused. Day closed with roses and quiet. Willow did not bark at the ambassador. I think she understood. A staff member tucked in the duvet with gentle hands, then bowed once and left. The door clicked shut. The birch still stands. She closed the book. Moving to the window, she gazed out over London, glimmering, breathing, untamed, beyond the palace gates. Somewhere, children were dreaming. Somewhere else, Parliament debated. And here, one woman stood, having held both world and silence. She turned out the light. The room hushed. Elizabeth climbed into bed. The Queen turned to her side and exhaled. Not as monarch, not as history, as a woman, at rest. The crown slept not in vault or velvet, but in the steady heart of one who had carried it longer than anyone else. And, tomorrow, when the tea arrived at 7:30, she would rise, as always.